So it's Monday the 6th of April, also known as Monday in Holy Week. Holy Week is when we try to follow the events of Jesus' final week of ministry in sort of real time, really. So Sunday, we think about when he entered Jerusalem, and on Palm Sunday, Maundy Thursday, his Last Supper, Good Friday, when he was executed, Saturday when he lay in the tomb, and Easter Sunday. Well, we're stepping back a day because our reading today says that it happened 6 days before the Passover, or the eve of Passover was Good Friday. So 5 days before that takes us to Saturday. And this is an incident that happened just before Jesus entered into Jerusalem. I'm reading this from John chapter 12, and we'll be following the set readings for Holy Week during this week's virtual church. And it says, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus arrived at Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took about a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. He didn't say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put in it. Leave her alone, Jesus replied. It was intended she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. This is the gospel of the Lord. So picture that scene. They've just arrived at the end of a long journey. They've come all the way down from Galilee in the north. They've come up from Jericho. They've had crowds pressing around them, steep hill. They finally arrive in Bethany to stay with Martha and Mary. We've met these two ladies before. Do you remember? We were their guest on that occasion when Mary chose the better part and sat at Jesus' feet. And here they are, hungry. It's getting late. It's been a long day. Isn't it wonderful that Martha is about to bring in the food? So picture yourself there. Where might you be sitting? What would you be hearing? What might you be saying at the end of that heavy day? And perhaps supper's coming in. Maybe you can smell it. And suddenly you're aware that the other disciples are staring, and they're looking at Jesus, and down at his feet, there's Mary. Well, she sat at his feet before, but she seems to be doing something odd to his feet with her hair. And then, what's that smell? And this perfume spreads more and more around the room. When I've preached on this before, I often have some perfume with me, and I spray it about the place, just to tune us in to the picture. Can you see yourself there? I wonder how those disciples felt. I bet they felt pretty embarrassed, because Mary was doing something that seemed extraordinarily extravagant. When they heard that this perfume was worth more than a year's wages, perhaps they agreed with Judas. What a terrible waste. And yet, Jesus doesn't seem to think that. He seems to think that Mary's done a beautiful thing for him. All along that road, that trek, all the way down from the north where Galilee is, from the mountain where he was transfigured, through the busy crowds in Jericho and up the steep road from there to Jerusalem, Jesus has been trying to tell them the Son of Man is going to be handed over to the Gentiles. He will suffer, he will be executed. But on the third day, he'll be raised. Well, they brushed it aside. As Simon and Garfunkel said, a man hears what he wants to hear, disregards the rest. They'd not taken it on board because they didn't want something like this to happen to Jesus. They didn't want to think about such awful things. They were enjoying all the acclamation and the crowds. But Mary had taken this in. Do you remember her sitting at the feet of Jesus before? She's actually picked up what none of them have noticed, that Jesus is preparing himself for a terrible ordeal. And she wants to do something about it. She wants to show that there's at least somebody who gets what he's going through, who understands. And so she takes this jar of expensive ointment and does something that it never occurred to any of the other disciples to do, to pour it out for Jesus. Now, I don't know what a year of your wages might come to, but imagine that. A whole year of wages worth of perfume, and she thought Jesus was worth it. Her worship was about saying, Jesus, you are worth it, not in the way of whichever cosmetic company it is, because you're worth it. It's actually because Jesus is worth it that she wants to do this. Just think for a moment what that jar of ointment must have meant. You see, in a situation where there were few banks, that was almost certainly an investment for the future. It was maybe their hopes. It was a strange household, Mary and Martha, because there was no husband, there was no father. That was very unusual in those days. It meant they had no financial security, because that's how society was organized in that place and at that time. Did that represent their hopes for some security, their ability to survive through their old age without hunger and impoverishment? Or was it some sort of dowry? Did it represent their hope of being married in the future? There was a lot riding on it. And Mary said, I've finally seen that Jesus wants to give himself for me. So I'm going to give the very best I can for him. And I suppose that's what Holy Week is about, really, walking in the way of the cross. Trying to imagine, as Mary did so well, what Jesus was going through. Trying to understand the sheer depth of love that was motivating him as he prepared to lay down his life for Mary, for all those disciples, including the ones who didn't get it, and for us as well. And that means that we have to, perhaps as we take up our own cross in this Holy Week, ask how rich and full is our response to such love. Sometimes we'd sooner not. We like to have Jesus and other things in our lives, and Jesus does not begrudge us those things. But his blessing is most deeply on us when we surrender them to him, when we don't hold back from him, but yield the things that are precious to us, to his lordship, because that, when they're given into his hands, is what enables him to bless those things and to enrich us with his presence, his joy, his peace, his love. May we bow our heads in prayer. So, dear Lord, help us to respond to your love with our heart's love, as Mary did. In Jesus' name, Amen.